There we are. Okay. The most beautiful cord, the spinal cord. Okay, now let's get into neuro. I mean, this structure is so beautiful. Look at it. Okay, so let's talk about the medulla spinalis, the spinal cord. Okay, so basically talk about some interesting facts, what is the length, of the spinal cord, what is the weight of the spinal cord, and what is basically the nerve density of the spinal cord. Okay, so basically you put the spinal cord on the scale, it's approximately 35 grams. All right, so the spinal cord is approximately 35 grams and approximately 42 to 45 centimeters in length, starting at the foramen magnum and ending at the intervertebral disc between L1 and L2 in an adult, and ending as well at L3 within the newborn. All right, and then we have got so many neurons actually within the gray matter of the spinal cord actually. So that is basically the density of nerves in the spinal cord. So it's one of the very interesting facts actually of the spinal cord that it's also part of the central nervous system, even though it's outside of the cranium actually, right? Giving off 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So remember that it gives off 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So anyway, that's basically the spinal cord starting at the foramen magnum and ending approximately at the intervertebral disc between L1 and L2, right? With basically 8, right, cervical nerves and 12 thoracic and 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal nerve. And basically the spinal cord along each, the length of the spinal cord actually shows enlargements. So there are specific points where actually the spinal cord has enlargements, and we see the enlargements in the cervical region, what we call the cervical enlargements, at the region where we find the outlets actually for the brachial plexus. That is around the region of C5 up to T1. We see enlargement there that we call the cervical enlargement, which is the largest enlargement actually. Then it tapers and then enlarges as well in the lumbar region, where it gives off the lumbosacral plexus actually to supply the lower limbs. So when it's supplying the upper limb, there's an enlargement. Supplying the lower limb, there is an enlargement at that point. All right. So the spinal cord, yes, ending at the level of L1 or intervertebral disc between L1 and L2. At this level, what then happens? So if the spinal cord is ending at L1, right? But does that mean that the spinal cord doesn't give? But we say it also gives, sacral and lumbar nerves as well as first coccygeal. What happens to these guys? So during development, actually, right, the spinal nerves were coming at the intervertebral, the corresponding intervertebral levels at that level. But there's a phenomenon that we call the recession phenomenon, when the spinal cord doesn't grow in length as fast as the spinal canal, actually, or the spine, actually. So the spine is growing faster in length. So the spinal cord does recession. That means looking at the spinal cord, it has all segments at this point up to C1, right? So it has all segments up to C1. So it has its own segments actually, but do not confuse the segments of the spinal cord and the segment of the spine actually. All right. So these nerves that actually be exiting out, they still have to exit through the corresponding intervertebral foraminers, right? So these spinal nerves will be, within the fluid, actually, the cerebral spinal fluid, and then they come off. And this structure, which looks like a tail of a horse, is called the cauda equina. So equina, actually, that's a horse. So the caudal part of the horse, that's the tail. So the cauda equina, these are basically these nerves floating within the cerebral spinal fluid. So if you are to do a lumbar puncture, you have to do it below L1. So basically, between L3 and 4, you can just tap there. It's very, very safe. So that's basically it concerning the spinal nerves. So at the tip of this spinal cord, there is this structure that goes to attach on the coccygeal body that we call a phylum terminale, right? So it's a terminal phylum, so it's called the phylum terminale, attaching the lower extent of the spinal cord, basically anchoring it to this the coccygeal, the dorsal part of the coccygeal bone, right? So that's basically that. And then we see that the spinal cord has got coverings, actually, the meningeal coverings, right, that we do in Introduction to Neuro. So we've got three meningeal coverings, actually. We have the dura mater, right? So from outside, we have the dura mater, right? We have the arachnoid mater, and that one which is adherent to the spinal cord, which is the pia mater, actually, right? So the pia mater will end, right? So the pia mater will end where the spinal cord also ends as well, because these are adhering to each other. But this pia mater is the one that gives this ligament, right? This phylum terminale. That's also pia mater extending there, right? But we actually just say pia mater ends where the spinal cord ends, and then there is a ligament actually from the pia mater. And then outside that is the arachnoid and the dura mater. So the arachnoid and the dura mater will be continuous with each other, and they end at the level of S2. So put that in your mind. The arachnoid and the dura, they end at the level of S2. So you know that below the arachnoid is a space that called the subarachnoid space. So if this is the arachnoid at this point, the subarachnoid space is the space between the arachnoid and the pia. And that's the space that we see being filled with what? With the cerebrospinal fluid. And this is where the spinal nerves are entering first and they're floating. So can you see this bag, right? Because the arachnoid and the dura are ending at the level of S2. That's very, very important. Right, so that's it about the spinal cord. And then let's look at the basic plan of the spinal cord if we cut it, giving a horizontal section actually. So I want you to understand this. This is the basics of the neuroanatomy of the spinal cord. You understand here, life will be very easy. So the spinal cord is an H-shaped, actually, gray matter within. So the spinal cord is an H-shaped gray matter within, and then the white matter at this point. But now with staining, this what I'm calling white matter is darker actually. But I want you to know that this one, which is actually pale, is the gray matter. So what you appreciate is that we have a central canal actually, which is continuous with the fourth ventricle, right? And then we actually see that we have the gray matter, right, around the central canal, joining the two parts of the spinal gray matter. And the spinal gray matter actually is in horns. So we have a dorsal horn. So there is a dorsal horn, right? And then we have the ventral horn, right? So this, large ventral horn. So with this section, we actually see a large ventral horn, right? But the spinal cord also gives a small horn, not visible with this section, which is actually a lateral horn, actually, right? But that lateral horn, or what called the intermedial lateral gray matter, is found in certain sections of the spinal cord. And with this section, it had no intermedial lateral gray matter, right? So that's it. So we have the posterior horn and the large anterior horn at this point, right? And then we have the connecting gray matter. And then around the gray matter, we actually see the white matter. And then this white matter, this is how it is. So the spinal cord actually has a ventral. So this is front, right? So this is front or ventral. So it has a ventral median sulcus or fissure. So it is a ventral median sulci that we see at this point, a ventral median sulcus at this point, right? And this ventral median sulcus is filled with pia mater. So remember that pia mater, this one that is adherent to the spinal cord, continues into the ventral feature that we have at this point. Right, so I actually call it the ventral sulcus, actually, because you know it's a bit shallow. Right, then we see that there is pyometer there, and this is an artery at this point. We'll talk about this later on. Right, so there is this ventral median sulcus. Then we have a dorsal median fissure at this point. Right, we have a dorsal median fissure at that point. Right, at that point, and you see it's so slim compared to this one. And you know, some texts actually say it's just filled with the neuroglial matter. It's actually not pyometer, but actually neuroglial matter that is there actually, right? So first line, this one, the second line is that one. We now want to divide our white matter. The second landmark is looking at this point. We see the white matter that is coming to join with the dorsal horn, right? The white matter, this is whereby you we form the dorsal roots actually. So this is where we actually form the dorsal roots of the spinal cord, right? So this tract, so these roots will just get in and they join into this small tract that leads to the dorsal horn, which is called the dorsolateral tract of Lewis. That's an interesting tract, the dorsolateral tract of Lewis. Right, so now we have another line there and another line at this point, so I can actually shade at that point and also shade at this point. Then another thing we need to appreciate, from the anterior horn, we have the ventral roots for the motor, right, supplying the motor muscles, right? So from there we have these motor actually roots coming off at this point. We see these motor roots coming off at this point, the motor roots coming off at this point, right? So with this now, so this is basically going to be supplying motor. So this is basically efferent actually coming out of the central nervous system. And this is basically afferent, coming with sensory information coming into the central nervous system. So these are the dorsal roots and these are the ventral roots actually. This is the dorsal horn, this is the ventral horn. So with this now, we divide our white matter into funiculus. So you need to know the difference between a funiculus and a fasciculus. So a funiculus is larger than a fasciculus, all right? So if I group up fasciculus, right, or fasciculi, they make up a funiculi. So anyway, between this fissure and the dorsal horn or the dorsal tract is what we call the dorsal white funiculus. So this is dorsal white funiculus, all right? So that's a dorsal white funiculus at this point. So this is a dorsal white funiculus, right? Comprises of ascending tracts. Sorry for that. And then between the ventral sulci and these ventral roots, this area is what we call the ventral funiculus. So that was a dorsal funiculus. This is a ventral funiculus, right? What about between the two roots, the dorsal roots and the ventral roots? What funiculus is this? So this is basically a lateral funiculus. So this is basically the lateral funiculus. And interestingly, the lateral funiculus is large, hence it's divided into two parts, right? We have a dorsolateral, right? We have a dorsal, which is at the back. So it's lateral, but this section is dorsal. So it's called a dorsolateral funiculus. And then here we have a ventral lateral funiculus. But all of them are then part of the lateral funiculus. So this is a ventral funiculus, right? And this is a dorsal funiculus. Just that, just that. Then let me explain a certain phenomenon that we need to understand. So these are the roots, actually, right? So these are dorsal roots, ventral roots. Are we together? So these are sensory, right? So these are sensory, actually. And let me change the color there. And this is motor. So the blue is motor, actually, right? So the blue is motor. So we have the sensory roots, right? And the motor roots. So they join, right? And they form a spinal nerve. So they join and then they form a spinal nerve within the intervertebral foramina, right? When they form a spinal nerve, the spinal nerve would then ramify, right? So these are roots, right? These are horns. The spinal will ramify such that we have motor that will go ventral and motor that will go dorsal. The same way we will have sensory that goes dorsal and sensory that go ventral actually. So those that will actually be going ventral are many in number. And these ones will be going dorsal, they just be supplying the dorsal strip, that back, they're supplying the muscles of the back and the skin of the back as well. So this is what we call a dorsal rami. So get that right. This is now the dorsal rami of a spinal nerve. So this is the compound. The compound at this point, that's the spinal nerve, right? So this is the dorsal rami. So that's the dorsal rami, and this is the ventral rami of a spinal nerve. So if this level is like C5, right? If this is C5, that nerve, this is the nerve C5 formed from the dorsal um, root, right? The dorsal root, and here from the ventral root, and then we form a spinal nerve. The spinal nerve ramifies into a dorsal rami and a ventral rami. And you see most of the questions they ask you concerning the plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbosacral plexus, true or false, they are formed from the ventral rami of the spinal nerves. That's true. The brachial plexus doesn't come from the dorsal rami. It's actually the ventral rami. So is the lumbosacral plexus, right? So in your anatomy, we don't talk a lot about the dorsal rami. It doesn't have much interesting facts at that point. Right, so the gray matter actually within the spinal cord was then divided into lamina and nuclei. So it was divided into lamina by a guy called Rex actually. So it's called the Rex lamina. So these lamina are called the Rex lamina. So they saw that, with different areas of the gray matter, actually we find different cells doing different functions, and we have got different physiological units as well within these parts of gray matter. So actually divided into lamina. And at the same point, they also divided it actually into nuclei. So there is no hassle for you. You just need to appreciate that we have got nuclei within the gray matter. We also can divide into lamina, right? So I can actually tell you that the nucleus proprius, right? The nucleus proprius is lamina 3 and 4. That means if you look at this nucleus, you can actually correspond and say, no, this is where you have lamina 3 and 4. That's all, right? So like this is very different from this area actually. We actually say that this nucleus are within the lamina. All right, so we have lamina number 1 up to 10. Actually, we have lamina number 1 up to 10. So I'll explain it in a very, 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 very simple way. All right, so this is it. With lamina number 1, right, and lamina number 2. So this region is basically sensory. So the dorsal horn is basically sensory, and the ventral horn is basically motor, right? And intermediate at this point, it's autonomic, right? So you remember that sensory, motor, and then autonomic. That's very good. So lamina number 1 and number 2 is basically for pain modulation. So this is basically for pain actually. So lamina number 1 and lamina number 2 are basically for pain, right? Also including lamina number 3. So lamina number 1 up to lamina number 3 can say they contain neurons actually for pain actually, right? So they contain the neurons actually for pain. Are we together? Right? And then we then look at lamina number 4 and lamina number 5. All right, so lamina number 4 and lamina number 5. You look at the nucleus there. We have a nucleus that we call the nucleus dorsalis. I will talk about it that we find in lamina number 4 and lamina number 5. All right, interesting. Then we have got this lamina actually that I want to talk about, which is basically lamina 10, right? So why did I jump from there to there? This lamina, I just need to know, this lamina is basically gray matter around the central canal. There's nothing interesting with that. All right, then jumping from there, let me look at lamina number 9. So lamina number 9 is what I want you to put in your minds. Lamina number 9 is a lamina that has got neurons that feed the motor neurons, actually. right? You know those motor neurons that supply the skeletal muscles, right? Those neurons actually are within lamina number 9. So put at the inner mind, lamina number 9. So lamina number 9 has neurons that supply the skeletal muscles, right? So the alpha motor neurons that supplies the skeletal muscles. We find that in lamina number 9. Are we together? So lamina number 9, lamina number 1 to 3, that's pain actually, right? Lamina number 4 and 5, that's where we see these ones being the nucleus dorsalis. I'll talk about it later on. So lamina number 9 is supplying the alpha motor neurons. And then you also see lamina, like lamina number 8. This lamina is basically full of interneurons. Can you see there's nothing, no nucleus specific at this point. There's nothing specific at this point. So lamina number 8 is basically a lamina of interneurons, right? So this is where we actually find the interneurons. And then lamina number 7, lamina number 7 is mainly for, if you look at where it is, remember, this region, I say that's autonomic, right? So that's where you find the autonomic neurons. Remember, sympathetic outflow is thoracolumbar, right? So that's where we find the neurons at that point in lamina number 7. Also, we find the interneurons as well in that lamina. And then lamina number 6 is found in regions where we have the limbs, like where you see the brachial plexus, where you see the lumbosacral plexus. So this lamina is, has got neurons that usually work with the movement of joints, right? And also the neurons actually that play with the reflexes are occurring at that spinal level. But what's really, really important is that 1 to 3, that's pain, right? 9, that's motor neurons. 8, that's interneurons. 7, those are the autonomic neurons. And then 10, this is basically gray matter around that. So that's how we divide it into lamina. Then when you come and divide it into nuclei, this is so simple. You remember, this is the margin, right, of the dorsal horn. That's the margin of the dorsal horn. So we have a small nuclei that is called the posterior marginal nucleus, or in simple term, you call it the marginal nucleus. 1. 2, we have a nucleus actually that is actually gelatinous. So it's called a gelatinous substance. So it's called the substantia gelatinosa. So the substantia gelatinosa is basically lamina number 2. If you can check there, that's lamina number 2. Are we together? It deals with pain modulation. And then we have the nucleus propria. So you get it, the proper nucleus. You just call it the proper nucleus. So the nucleus proprius takes a number of lamina from 3, 4, also 5. All right, so 3 also to 5 actually. This also has got neurons actually that deal with pain actually, that deal with pain sensations and temperature sensation as well, right? Then we have this nucleus that's called the nucleus dorsalis, and got neurons that deal with proprioception coming from the joints and the muscle spindles and the Golgi organ tendons. Actually, the nucleus dorsalis, it reports to the cerebellum actually. So the nucleus dorsalis has got neurons that report to the cerebellum, right? That's what I want you to get. Nucleus dorsalis has got neurons that report to the cerebellum concerning the proprioception, the state actually of the joints. We talked about this with the guys that I was with yesterday when we were talking about the basal ganglia and the cerebellum in forming a motor complex. All right. Then this is the intermediate lateral nucleus that I was talking about, where you actually see the autonomic nucleuses, right? Interesting. Then when it comes to the ventral horn, which is motor, the ventral horn, which is motor. What I want you to appreciate is this. We have in lamina number 9, so if you check lamina number 9, these are the nuclei that are being pointed. I have interest in these blue nuclei at this point. The blue nuclei is this point, actually. So these blue nuclei actually, they supply, special type of muscles, actually. So these nuclei actually are these ones. So there is what you call the phrenic nucleus. So if you cut the spinal cord between the segments of C3, 4, and 5, you actually see that the neurons that you have at this point, they supply the diaphragm. That's where we see the phrenic nerve coming out actually. So the nucleus, we find the phrenic nucleus at C3, C4, and C5, right? Then also between C1 up to C5, also in the cervical region, there's a nucleus that is called the accessory nucleus. So from this accessory nucleus, it supplies the muscles of the neck. And from this accessory nucleus, we find the neurons, motor neurons coming out and forming the spinal part of the accessory cranial nerve number 11. Remember, it is a spinal part and the cranial part. So the spinal part is actually coming from here, the accessory nucleus, right, supplying the muscles of the the brachial arches, actually, right, the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. Then the last nucleus is what we call the lumbosacral nucleus. The lumbosacral nucleus. Of these three, we talked of the phrenic supplying the diaphragm, we talked of accessory supplying the muscles, right, of the neck, and then here we have what we call the lumbosacral nucleus. This supplies the muscles of the pelvic diaphragm, or the pelvic muscles, or the perineal muscles, basically. So perineal muscles, diaphragm, and the muscles of the neck, they come from lamina number 9. Why? Because they're all skeletal as well, but at this point, actually. Are we together? Then we have these other nuclei being ventral medial and all these ones. Now these are supplying basically all the other muscles, actually. So that's how we basically group the gray matter in a simple way. All right. So anyway, looking at the spinal cord, we have got ascending tracts and descending tracts, actually. Right. We looked at the gray matter. Fine. Now we're looking at the white matter. So we've got the ascending and the descending tracts. So let me start with who is descending, right? The descending tracts, actually. Right. So for the descending tracts, right, this is mainly command. So we expect it on this part of the spinal cord. Remember, this is basically where we need to see the efferent coming out, right? So we see much of the descending at this point. All right. So who are these descending? So looking, remember the funiculus, we said the lateral funiculus and then the ventral funiculus and the dorsal funiculus. So in the lateral funiculus, we see the lateral corticospinal tracts. We'll talk about this one later on. The lateral corticospinal tracts, this comprises about 80 to 85%, or some say 80 to 90% of the corticospinal fibers that are coming from the cortex to the spinal cord to supply the skeletal muscles, actually. Those that decussated at the pyramids, actually, they form the lateral corticospinal tracts, and we find it at this point, 1. So we're done with this one. Then let's talk about a friend to this one. So this is the lateral corticospinal tract, and the friend to this one is what we call the rubrospinal. So the rubrospinal, from the way the rubro, it's coming from the red nucleus within the midbrain. So it's coming from the red nucleus to the spinal cord and doesn't have much of the functions in humans, actually. Fine. Then from there, at this point, let me cut at this point, and this is the lateral funiculus, actually, and this is the ventral funiculus. So here, looking at this point, I want you to appreciate of this tract at this point, right? So can you see it's at the margins of the spinal cord, and it's at the margins of the spinal cord, right? The periphery of the spinal cord, right? And it's stretching from the ventral funiculus to the lateral funiculus. This is called the vestibulo, so just get it, the vestibulo spinal tracts. So they're basically coming from the vestibular nucleuses, the vestibular nucleuses that you find within the brainstem, coming to the spinal cord, and it's basically supplying the muscles of posture, right? Basically supplying the muscles of posture, the vestibulospinal tracts. That's very interesting. Then a friend of the vestibulospinal is also called the olivospinal. So the olivary nuclei, right? We also have this one, also the olivospinal tract, also coming to the spinal cord from the olivary nucleus. This also works with the cerebellum as well, right? Then we have, so we're done with these two at this point. So the olivospinal and the vestibulospinal, they are seen at the margins here, also appearing in the lateral funiculus as well as the ventral funiculus, right? Then at this point, we also see a friend as well of the vestibulospinal, which is called the tectospinal, right? So the tectospinal is basically coming from the tectum, the superior colliculus, coming from the tectum, which is the superior colliculus within the midbrain, and then going to the spinal cord. And this mainly supplies the muscles of the neck in terms of reflexes of movement of the head to sound stimuli as well as visual stimuli, right? And then we have the ventral corticospinal tract. So we actually have the ventral corticospinal tract. Remember, we have the lateral, Here we see the ventral corticospinal tract within the ventral funiculus. And this comprises about 15% of the corticospinal tracts that did not decussate at the pyramids, but actually are going to decussate as well at the spinal level, about 15% actually, the ventral corticospinal tracts. Then the yellow ones, here we see is the medial and the lateral. The medial and the lateral actually. This is what we call the reticulospinal. So they're basically coming from the reticular formation, going to the spinal cord, also supplying the muscles of posture actually. The lateral reticulospinal, this is mainly coming from the medulla, right? Mainly coming from the medulla, and the medial reticulospinal mainly coming from the pons. And usually this one which is coming from the pons is basically excitatory, right? And that one coming from the medulla is basically inhibitory to the muscles of posture, the extensor muscles of posture. So this is basically about the descending tracts. Then we're looking at the ascending tracts. At the dorsal funiculus, right, we see two fasciculus actually within the dorsal funiculus. We actually see the Fasciculus Gracilis. This is basically taking the sensory information from the region of the lower limbs below the level of T6. So if I cut the body at T6, so below the level of T6, right, the sensory information coming, which is not touch, which is not crude touch as well as pain and temperature, they have to use the Fasciculus Gracilis. So this basically from the lower limbs. Interesting. And then the Fasciculus Cuneatus is coming above all the sensory information coming above the level of T6, which is not pain, crude touch, and temperature, is coming from mainly the upper limbs. So I can basically say the upper limbs actually. That is the funiculus, the Fasciculus Cuneatus actually. So this is very important for you to know that the Gracilis, that's from the lower limbs, the Cuneatus, that's from the upper limbs. Interesting. Then looking at the lateral funiculus, So if I cut the spinal cord at this point, this is the rest of the lateral funiculus. What I want you to appreciate is that in the ventral funiculus, we don't have any descending tracts. In the ventral funiculus, we don't have any descending tracts actually. So we see them all in the lateral funiculus. So if there be a question saying the what, right, you can actually see it all has to start with spinal. It all has to start with spinal. So if there's ask you a question, the spinal XXX, right, the spinal whatever, right, tract is found within the ventral funiculus, that's false. We don't have anything there, right? So who are these guys? So we have the guys that we find at the margins that are going to the cerebellum. So they're called the spinal cerebella. So we have what we call a dorsal, right? It's found at the back, and a ventral that is found in front, spinal cerebellar tract. So the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract is traversing and moving to the cerebellum, and it's moving with proprioception, what we call non-conscious proprioception, which is proprioception of the regions of the body where you have got no idea, like the joints, the muscle spindles, right? The non-conscious proprioception is moving with this dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. So the conscious proprioception of you knowing exactly where your body is, it actually moves with these fasciculus at this point. But actually, the non-conscious proprioception actually moves with the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. And the ventral spinal cerebellar tract, this takes information from mainly the lower limbs actually. Information from the lower limbs in terms of how the reflexes are going and the position as well of the joints of the lower limbs, right? That mainly, I want you to focus on the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract actually, right? And then here we have the spinal thalamic tracts, right? The famous ones that move with pain and temperature, right? As well as crude touch. So this spinal thalamic tract is divided into a lateral and a ventral. So a lateral and a ventral. A lateral and a ventral spinal thalamic tract. And now we appreciate that the ventral spinal thalamic tract moves with crude touch as well as pressure, and the lateral spinal thalamic tract move with pain and temperature. Then within the spinal thalamic, we find a friend which is called the spinal tector. It also carries pain sensation that go to the region, which is the tector. Remember, when you say tectospinal, the tectum, which is the superior colliculus, basically, this is mainly for pain sensations going there for the sake of reflexes. So this is basically the descending and the ascending tracts of the spinal cord. Then appreciating the color codes that we have at this point, the gracile fasciculus from the lower limb, cuneate from the upper limb, dorsal spinal cerebellar tract, non-conscious proprioception, ventral spinal cerebellar tract coming from the lower limbs, and with the spinal olivary coming from the spinal cord to the olivary nuclei, and then we have the spinal thalamic as well with the spinal tectile as well, right? And then we also see on this side the descending tracts, those ones that are coming from the red nucleus, right, going to the spinal cord, right? The rubrospinal also moving with the lateral corticospinal tracts. And at this point, we have the reticulospinal. That I said we have the lateral coming from the medulla, and we have the medial from the pons, actually, right? Then we have the vestibulospinal, right? The vestibulospinal, and then we have the tectospinal, as well we have the ventral corticospinal that comprise the fiber that did not decussate within the pyramids, actually. Then the lateral corticospinal tracts, which is around 80% actually decussated at the level of the pyramids. So that's basically it. That's the basic structure of the spinal cord. All right, and then these are basically the nucleuses that we're talking about, right? And remember, they're laminar, and these are basically the functions of these nucleuses. There isn't much for you to know the encrem. Just know this one is pain, this one is pain, this one is also pain, right? This one deals with proprioception and reports to the cerebellum. That's why here it's working with the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. And these ones that we find usually in the lamina 7, the intermedial lateral nucleuses, are basically for the autonomic system, for so the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic is a sacral outflow actually, and the sympathetic is actually thoracolumbar. Then for the ventral, that is what? For the motor, right? The muscles, right? The skeletal muscles that we find there, we have got the medial nuclei that supplies all the muscles of the trunk, all right? And then we have the lateral group that supplies all the muscles of the limbs, right? And then those specific nuclei that I talked about, being the phrenic nuclei, the accessory nuclei, and the lumbosacral nuclei that innervates the muscles actually of the pelvis and the perineum, and then the accessory that innervates the muscles, the trapezius and the sphenoidemastoid, the phrenic that innervates the diaphragm. So this is basically it. That's the simplest things you can actually remember when it comes to the spinal cord. So in the next segment of the tutorial, we're basically going to be looking at specific tracts actually that you need to study in detail, and then also look at blood supply, and we look at the pulses actually of the spinal cord lesion actually. So basically that's that. So ladies and gentlemen, friends, let's move on to the next segment of the tutorial. Zoom has just given us a few seconds to talk about what we just talked about. So let's see each other in the next segment. Then we can talk about the rest of the spinal cord.